Welcome to a new episode from Perfect English Podcast. Today we're going to focus on vocabulary, words we can use to talk about global problems. But before we start, let me remind you that I have created a quiz that you can take after you listen to this episode to check your understanding of the things we talked about in this episode, and of course to retain the information that you learn in this episode. So now, without further ado, let's get to it and start talking about global problems. Now let's start talking about disasters or tragedies, and unfortunately we hear about these things happening all the time. Now we will start with the first four most common disasters or tragedies we hear about on TV or in the news. Now the first one is earthquake. Now the earthquake is when the earth moves or trembles. We call this an earthquake. The second most common disaster is a flood. And flood happens when there is too much rain and a large amount of water covers an area which is usually dry. There is also the opposite of a flood, and that is a drought. A drought when there is no rain at all. And by the way, drought is spelled D-R-O-U-G-H-T. And our fourth most common disaster is a volcano. Now, the volcano happens when hot liquid, rock, and gases pour from a mountain. So, of course, these are the four most famous, we can say, disasters. And, of course, some of the most devastating. But these are not all. There are other disasters or tragedies that sometimes are even more serious than these four. So let's learn about these as well. Now, we have famine. Now, famine is a big problem that is actually happening in many places around the world. And this problem or this disaster means that there is no food and people are starving. Or we can have a problem of a landslide. Now, landslide is rocks and earth moving suddenly down a slope. Now, of course, this problem is usually bigger when it happens next to a place where there are people, and a landslide can literally bury those people under tons of rocks and earth. We also have epidemic. An epidemic is disease affecting large numbers of people. Or we can have an explosion, which is usually caused by a bomb. Or we can have a major accident, something like a plane crash. Or we can have a hurricane, tornado, typhoon, or tropical storm. And all these four words refer to violent winds and storms with results that can be devastating. And of course, there is the number one tragedy that is everywhere around the world, unfortunately, and that is war. There is always war going on somewhere. And there is another word we use and we call civil war. Now, the civil war is different from war in general because this is the war between people of the same country. Of course, both are unfortunate and very tragic, but so that you know that war is a general word, civil war is a specific word. Now, note that disasters not caused by human beings can be called natural disasters. For example, the earthquake, the flood, the drought, volcano, hurricane, tornado, these are natural disasters, not like the war, civil war. And now that we've learned about these words, it is useful to learn some verbs we can use with these words. For example, when we talk about a volcano, what do we say? A volcano explodes just like a bomb? No, we say a volcano erupts. For example, we can say a volcano has erupted in Indonesia. So erupt is the verb you would want to use with the word volcano. We can say hundreds are feared dead. And this is something we usually hear in the news when we don't know exactly the death toll. We don't know how many people died, but we have fears that a lot of people, in this case hundreds, are feared dead. And how about the word epidemic? What do we say? An epidemic, as we said, it's disease that affects large number of people, and usually governments or the WHO, the World Health Organization, try to contain the epidemic because they don't want it to spread. So we use the verb spread with epidemic. For example, we say, the flu epidemic spread rapidly throughout the country. We talked about famines, when there's no food, and the problems with famines that millions are starving. We can say millions are starving as a result of the famine. And how about an earthquake? What do we say about the earthquake? What does it do? Does it move the earth? Or can we say it shakes the earth? Well, the verb to use is shake. We can say a big earthquake shook the city at noon today. We can say the area is suffering its worst drought in many years. And how about civil war? If civil war starts somewhere, do you think we have a special verb we can use for this case? Actually, we do. We can say civil war has broken out in the north of the country. So civil war or war in general can break out, can start somewhere. It's like an explosion, but we don't use the verb explode for everything. Remember, for the volcano, we say erupt. For the civil war, we say break out. And finally, with a tornado, we can say a tornado swept through the islands yesterday. And when we use the verb sweep with a tornado or a strong storm, that means it moves very quickly. And of course, in the case of a tornado or a hurricane, with devastating effects. And now we talked about the disasters themselves or the tragedies, and we talked about verbs we can use with these tragedies. But how about words relating to people involved in these disasters or tragedies? For example, we can say the explosion resulted in 300 casualties. And the word casualty is spelled C-A-S-U-A-L-T-Y, casualty. Of course, in plural is casualties. Well, what does it mean, 300 casualties? When we say 300 casualties, we mean dead or injured people. So it's not only for dead people. If we want to say dead, we can say the explosion resulted in 300 dead. We don't say casualties. Casualties, remember, it is used for dead and injured people. We can also say the real victims of civil war are children left without parents. Now, the victims, of course, are those who suffer the results of a tragedy or a disaster. And if you think about it, the real victims of civil war or any kind of war are actually the children, because their parents are gone, usually for no good reason. Anyway, coming back to what we're here for, we can say there were only 3 survivors. All the other passengers were reported dead. Maybe we're talking here about a plane crash. Only 3 survivors. Now, when we talk about survivors, we're talking about people who lived through a disaster. We can say thousands of refugees have crossed the border looking for food and shelter. Now, the word refugees mean people who have escaped from their own country because of a war or other disaster. It is not always war. Refugees can be because of war or other natural disasters maybe, but the most common reason for refugees to leave their country is usually war, of course. We can also say millions of migrants enter the country each year looking for a better life. Now, migrants is a different word. They're not refugees. Now, refugees are forced to leave their country. Migrants might be forced in a way or another to leave their country, but they do it on their own accord. They decide to leave their country. They're not actually forced like the refugees. These are people who travel from one country to another, often in order to find work. So in a way, they may be forced to leave their country because there's no work, but it's not because of a disaster. When it happens like that, we call them refugees. When they decide to leave their country because of any other reason other than disasters, we call them migrants. And we can say during the battle, the dead and wounded were flown out in helicopters. Now, obviously the dead people, but the wounded, what do we mean by the wounded? The wounded are the people who are injured in a battle or by a weapon. So we talked about disasters and tragedies, and we talked about the verbs we can use with disasters and tragedies, and the words for people involved in disasters or tragedies. And finally, before we go, we're gonna talk about diseases and epidemics. Of course, there are a lot, and there are new epidemics we hear about every day, but the most famous diseases or epidemics that we hear about all the time, that have been here for a long time actually, and they're still serious conditions that can threaten human life, are ones like rabies. And rabies is a disease that can be caused by bite from a dog, fox, etc. And it is a very serious condition that can cause death. We have AIDS, which is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, often caused by sexual contact or contact with contaminated blood. And that is also a serious condition which we don't have a cure for so far. We also have malaria, which is a disease usually caught because of mosquito bites in specific parts of the world. And we also have cholera and typhoid. And these are diseases causing sickness, diarrhea, and they're usually caused by infected food and water. So that'll be all about our global problems for one day. I hope you never find yourself in one of these disasters, but obviously you hear about them all the time in the news and you need to understand these words. And if you want to describe one on your own, you need to have the proper vocabulary to be able to talk about global problems. Don't forget, we have a short and sweet quiz to test your understanding of all the things we talked about in this episode. And also, it helps retain the information you learn here today. You can find the link to the quiz in the description of this episode. So, that is all for today. This is Danny, your host, saying thank you very much for listening to yet another episode from Perfect English Podcast. I will see you again tomorrow in a new episode.